Well, you better buckle up for tomorrow. But before we go into tomorrow, I want to talk about yet another set of deception, except this time it's from Larry Summers, the guy who's always on TV, Harvard professor, and this is just disingenuous and, in my opinion, borderline fraudulent to be saying this. And it's fine to say it. This is obviously a true chart, but the implications are wrong without proper context, so that's what I'm here for. He says, this picture should be sobering to anyone convinced that we have reattained price stability. And what he's doing is he's implying that because the blue line went up and the orange line went up, the orange line being today, the blue line being the 1970s, then the blue line paused for a bit and then went right back up, that we might be on the same exact path. So, the question now is, are we on that same path, or are there some key differences of context to note? Well, ultimately, the question is for you to answer, but I will give you the context that the Harvard professor did not. And I don't think this is that unreasonable to consider this context because it is very important. In the 70s, we had unanchored inflation expectations, which were driven by an oil price shock and leaving the gold standard that had never been done before. The trust in fiat did not exist. Not that it really exists today, but at least we've played the game for the last 20 years and it's at least somewhat functioned, right? Whereas in the 70s, we're going to wheelbarrows of cash. And that, of course, is with recent oil price shocks in the 70s, which we did have at the beginning of the Russian invasion, but so far is gone. We did have multiple waves of inflation already, right? Original COVID, Delta, Omicron, war, and oil shock. But a lot of those were compressed around the same time that we printed endless amounts of money, and so expectations are, absent those shocks again, we should not see another spike like Larry Summers is talking about, as long as inflation expectations remain anchored. But in the 70s, we had a significantly key difference to today. An unanchoring of inflation expectations. So bad that when Paul Volcker sat down with his staff at the Federal Reserve Board in the early 80s, they said, folks, we have failed to control one thing. Inflation expectations. Now we need to put the big boy pants on thanks to the second wave of inflation and crush those expectations. And once expectations were crushed, guess what? The economy grew. The economy grew and we didn't have new inflation until we had the shocks of COVID again. We had no inflation, declining inflation all the way through the COVID pandemic. So keep that in mind, leaving the gold standard, oil price shocks, expectations. We also had the removal of price caps in the early 70s. Worth noting that in the late 60s, we actually had price caps on certain goods, and especially gas price caps. And when you remove those, you create a lot more inflation in a short period of time rather than allowing prices to go up. That's because it's politically popular to prevent prices from going up and putting in price caps. There were actually politicians recently who wanted to institute price caps again. But finally, we had smart people say, no, we don't want to repeat the mistakes of the 70s. That's why we're stuck with a lot of the inflation that we have now. That's why the Fed is dealing with it, to the extent, obviously, that they can. Now, this doesn't mean we're not going to go into recession. It doesn't mean the yield curve isn't inverted. It doesn't mean we're not going to have a stagnated economy. It just means that taking one picture out of context, once again, is stupid. It's unfair. It's designed to get clicks on social media. These people are lying to you. They're trying to evoke emotion without giving you the additional context. I want to shout out one of the commenters here, Mark Ferrara 12. Also, how about the fact that we have some of the largest structural deflationary tailwinds coming out of technology over the next 10 years? Electric vehicles continue to drive down the total cost of car ownership. AI, in general, can 2 to 10x productivity in the next 5 to 10 years across the industry. Robotaxis can reduce transportation costs by 70 to 80%. Let's not even get started by talking about humanoid robots. All quite frankly true. In fact, I talked about the Tesla bot on my Twitter earlier. But anywho, point is, even if things aren't as deflationary as Mark here suggests, those are tailwinds, not headwinds. The investment that companies are making today into artificial intelligence are not inflationary headwinds. They are disinflationary tailwinds. And what have we been seeing and talking about over the last few weeks? Not only what we talk about with course members, but what I talk about on the channel. Think about Walmart, Target, the employment agencies, all of the earnings calls we're looking at. Capital One, American Express, you name it. What are they all saying? Wow, a lot less inflation than we thought. I mean, we don't think we're going into deflation, but wow, the inflation's going away. You want to read that word for word? Look up John Deere, an industrial manufacturer from the ag business. This is good. Now, that is not to say we're all in bullish, everything's going to the moon. Look at Better, the SPAC today that just plummeted 93%. SPAC basically goes public at $10, right? Plummets 93% down to like $1. It's up like 45% in after hours, but that doesn't bring you back to halfway back, right? You're only at $1.50 instead of $10. One of the reasons for that, by the way, is a lot of the SPAC shareholders redeemed their shares before the SPAC. That's not going to make any sense. Let me simplify it. Basically, a lot of people are like, wait, you SPAC people are going to SPAC a mortgage company in this environment? I'm going to take my money out of this deal and just slowly walk away. And so you're left with no liquidity, so as soon as you actually IPO and somebody wants to sell, stock just tanks. That's kind of what happened there. Anyway, then you've got Jackson Hole. 7:05 tomorrow. I'll be live streaming it. I'll be back. I need to fly back. I'll be back. 7:05 tomorrow. I'll be in the studio. We'll be covering Jackson Hole. What are we expecting at Jackson Hole? Well, obviously, guidance from J-Pow. That's why the market sold down today, because people were nervous about, oh my gosh, what's J-Pow going to say tomorrow? Well, we need J-Pow to start recognizing some of the disinflationary forces. And if he just simply reiterates, look, if the disinflationary forces we're seeing now at businesses and jobs and wages continue, then we're good. Then we don't actually have to keep raising, and we can start planning cuts. That's all he has to do, and then it's conditional on what actually happens. He doesn't have to tell us, oh, it's definitely happening. It's just as long as it continues. You know, if inflation on anchors, then we'll hike. Duh. But it hasn't been disanchoring. It's been disinflating for the past 6 to 8 months. Well, really since last summer, but more predominantly over the last 6 to 8 months. And what did they say in the last minutes? In the last minutes of the Federal Reserve, they suggested, hey, we actually think that the majority of the disinflation is still ahead of us for the next 6 months, rather than the first 6 months. So we'll see what J-Powell says. We'll see what he says about wages. That's going to be a big deal as well. How much of job loss is he willing to accept? Hopefully very little, to cause as little economic pain as possible to get rid of this to get rid of the inflation that we're facing. We'll obviously be talking about this in the course member live stream tomorrow. I have set up myself, by the way, in such a way that I have a little bit of extra cash, because I think there'll be some volatility, but only a little bit, like probably somewhere around like 8% or so. So that way I can buy them dips on some of the companies that I think have big PB. Because nobody knows big PB better than I do. Nobody. We got to get that pricing power. That's what we want. That's why my plane says 69 for PP, okay? Big PP is what we want. Lots of pricing power. And those are the companies we want to be making investments in. Now I'm about to get run over, so instead I'm going to end the video. Check out the courses on Building Your Wealth link down below. Consider getting yourself some financial advice at stackhack.com. And consider investing in HouseHack, where we're getting sick deals. Just been working on a couple wedge deals that are probably going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of $125,000 to $150,000 a piece. Easy mode while making YouTube videos. Thanks so much, folks. We'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.